This story begins in 1588 and comes to a close in 1679. Now, these dates, 1588 and 1679, coincide with two very significant events in the history of this country. In 1588, Philip II of Spain sent the Great Armada to England. The principal goal of this fleet was to overthrow Elizabeth I, the Protestant Queen of England. 1588 was also the year in which Thomas Hobbes, arguably the greatest modern political philosopher, was born in Malmesbury in Wiltshire. In 1679, Parliament set to work on a bill to prevent Charles II's brother, the Catholic James, ever from becoming king. 1679 was also the year in which Thomas Hobbes finally died at the age of 91. Hobbes tells us in his autobiography that it was the frightening news of the coming Spanish Armada which sent his mother into labour. In remarking upon the circumstances of his birth, Hobbes reports that his mother gave birth to twins, himself and Fear. Now, as a matter of fact, Hobbes was born in April, whereas the Spanish Armada didn't set sail until August. But perhaps we can forgive Hobbes for misremembering the circumstances of his own birth. And in any case, it's not difficult to see why Hobbes might have said that he had fear for a twin, because he certainly lived during some very fearful times. During his long life, Hobbes witnessed a number of political crises and drastic regime changes. There was civil war in England, a king was executed, and a republic was established, only to collapse 11 years later. So perhaps it should come as no surprise to us that the greatest political philosopher of the Civil War period was above all concerned with political stability and civil order. After graduating from Oxford, Hobbes had the good fortune to find employment as a tutor with the Cavendish family, and was able for many years to enjoy a comfortable and scholarly existence. His patron, William Cavendish, was a wealthy Derbyshire landowner, who was also a member of the 1614 and 1621 parliaments. In 1640, though, Hobbes quit his life in England and fled for France, where he settled in Paris. Earlier that same year, he had offended many leading members of Parliament by arguing that there were no proper limits to the authority of the sovereign. Now, at a time when many members of Parliament were becoming increasingly frustrated at Charles I's absolutist tendencies, it was a hazardous thing to argue for the King of England's right to rule as an absolute monarch. But that is exactly what Hobbes had done in his 1640 political treatise, The Elements of Law. When, on November 7th of that year, John Pym and other anti-royalist members of Parliament attacked preaching for absolute monarchy, Hobbes came to fear for his safety and decided that life might be less dangerous in France, where, at least in 1640, the idea of absolute monarchy was less controversial than in England. Now, fleeing to Paris was probably a wise move on Hobbes's part. Within 2 years of his leaving England, the supporters of Parliament and the supporters of Charles I were at war. For the Royalists, it was God's will that Charles I should rule without being answerable to anyone. So, by challenging Charles I's authority, Parliament were defying the will of God. For the parliamentarians, however, not only was there no biblical support for the divine right of kings, but the people of England enjoyed certain traditional rights and freedoms to which Charles had become a threat. So it was necessary to challenge him. Between 1642 and 1649, the civil wars raged across Britain and Ireland, and ultimately Hobbes' side lost. After 7 years of bloody conflict, the Royalists were finally defeated for good. Charles I was put on trial for treason, and on 30th January 1649, he was executed. So, England was not an ideal place to be a Royalist in 1649. Many of Hobbes' fellow Royalists had by this time come to realise that they too would be safer in France and had joined him in Paris. In fact, Hobbes became close to the exiled royal family and acted as a tutor to the king's eldest son, the future King Charles II. By fleeing to Paris, Hobbes had escaped the turmoil of the civil wars. But during his time in Paris, he also enjoyed the company of many of the greatest minds France had to offer at this time, and he came into close contact with the exiled court and royal family. So you would have thought that Hobbes would have had quite enough of controversy by now, and that he would be careful to avoid offending any of his new colleagues and associates. But that is exactly what he failed to do. And in 1651, he was on the run again. And of all places, it was to Republican England that he fled. Just as in 1640, it was a work of political philosophy which had made Hobbes the subject of controversy. Today, Hobbes's work Leviathan is widely regarded as a masterpiece. In 1651, though, it shocked and offended many of his former friends and allies. In Leviathan, Hobbes tells us a story of his own. Hobbes's story is about the origins of political authority and how individuals come together to form a commonwealth. He asks us to imagine a situation very much like that of England during the Civil Wars, a situation where there is no common authority and power is contested. Wherever individuals are not united in obedience to a common authority, Hobbes tells us, there is nothing to prevent them from entering into hostilities with one another. So, under these circumstances, mutual distrust and the constant threat of violence are only to be expected. As Hobbes famously remarks, life under such conditions is nasty, brutish, and short. For Hobbes, then, it is rational for us to consent to be governed by a sovereign authority, powerful enough to bring order and stability to the land. The sovereign must become as powerful as the biblical beast Leviathan, whom the book of Job describes as follows: "Nothing on earth is his equal, a creature without fear. He looks down on all that are haughty. He is lord over all that are proud." Now, it seems clear that a king or a queen might be able to act as the kind of sovereign authority that Hobbes describes in Leviathan. So you might wonder why Hobbes offended royalist circles by taking the position which he did. After all, there's nothing specifically republican about maintaining that we should all consent to be governed by a powerful sovereign. But here is the point. Hobbes wants to say that whoever is in fact able to bring political stability to a territory deserves to be recognised as its sovereign. Charles I had failed to keep peace and stability, whereas Parliament had emerged triumphant from the civil wars. Hobbes doesn't allow that anyone has a divine or automatic right to rule a territory. For Hobbes, then, it was pointless to contest the legitimacy of the English Republic, now that Parliament was in control. Needless to say, this made Hobbes very unpopular in Parisian royalist circles. He was barred from the court, and there was even an attempt to have him arrested for his anti-Catholic opinions. So, in 1651, Hobbes fled back to England, and perhaps surprisingly, his former royalism was forgiven and he was able to settle in London. Now, as everyone knows, the English Republic was not to last. No doubt Hobbes must have felt a little bit embarrassed and perhaps anxious for his own safety and security when in 1660 his former pupil, Charles II, returned to England to become king. Fortunately for Hobbes, though, Charles remembered his former tutor, and far from seeking to persecute him, he actually granted him a generous pension. Once again, Hobbes had survived turbulent times. And Hobbes certainly was a great survivor. Perhaps there's something ironic about the fact that he had famously said that life outside of a strong political order would be nasty, brutish, and short. And yet, during some of the most chaotic and unstable times in the history of this country, he lived to the impressive age of 91. Hobbes finally died in December 1679. He had become seriously ill in October of that year, the same month that Parliament met for the second time in 1679 and were immediately dismissed. In July of the same year, Parliament had been dissolved while at work on a bill to exclude Charles II's brother James from the English succession. Once again, it seemed, Parliament and the English throne were in dispute, and once again, conflict and political disorder were on the horizon. When Hobbes eventually died on December 4th, his last words are reported to have been, "a great leap in the dark." Perhaps he was speaking about his own mortality. But as so often is the case in the life of Thomas Hobbes, he could just as easily have been speaking about the state of British politics as about himself. Perhaps Hobbes suspected that confusing and unpredictable times lay ahead for Britain. Of course, Hobbes could not possibly have guessed that within a few years of his death, there would be revolution once more in England, and a king would again be overthrown. But the next chapter in British history, the so-called Glorious Revolution, and the gradual emergence of a constitutional monarchy, is quite another story. Thank you.